Thanks, Chris. Good morning, colleagues. I too would like to acknowledge the Darug people, the traditional custodians of the land on which the Brian Brown Theatre sits, and pay my respects to all Aboriginal people past and present and here with us today. Well, it's fantastic to be with you here this morning. Brian Brown, who we're going to engage with later, is in fact the patron of something called Film By, which is a showcase of public school talent in the area of filmmaking, and we're really proud to have Brian Brown on that journey. He was in this theatre just a fortnight ago on Friday, where we showcased the best of those films from our primary and high school students right across the state. It gives me great pleasure this morning to introduce our Minister for Education and Early Childhood Learning in Sarah Mitchell. Our Minister has been at the helm of the portfolio since April this year. And quite a unique journey. You know, there she was at the beginning of a school year, handing her daughter across, Annabelle, who's 5, into kindergarten, into a fantastic public school in Gunnedah South Public School. And like all parents, I've been there myself, I've got another one to hand across in kindergarten next year. There's a little bit of trepidation, a lot of excitement, and our young people like Annabelle grow and thrive so quickly. But 2 months later, not only Annabelle, but right across the state, almost 1 million students across the sectors the Minister is now responsible for. And her youngest daughter, Matilda, is in early childhood in Gunnedah as well. We're really proud of our Minister, Gunnedah born and bred, a student of Gunnedah South Public School herself and Gunnedah High School, a really switched on careers advisor who indicated to Sarah when she was in her senior years that she'd make a wonderful politician. And you know how careers advisors and teachers can influence you as you're growing along the way. She parked that thought, but it's fantastic that she did then move on to politics. Many of you may not know this, but the first member ever elected to the Legislative Council from the number 11 spot on the ballot paper. So there's hope if you're down on the 12th spot or the 13th spot, or you're pursuing a career in politics as well. Our Minister is very passionate about education, and our former rock star Minister for Education in Adrian Piccoli did tweet this when the Minister was sworn in as Education Minister. Smart, experienced, a good listener, and most importantly, a good and kind person. Don't we want that of every single politician, every single minister? And we're very, very fortunate to have Sarah Mitchell as our Education Minister and Early Childhood Learning Minister in this state. Please join me in welcoming Minister Mitchell.
Well, what an introduction. Good morning, everybody. I too would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet here today, pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. Thank you, Chris, for having me. Thank you, Murat, for the introduction. You did neglect to say that when my careers advisor told me I should be a politician, I did not agree with him at all. I was very, I just thought, that'd be the worst job in the world. Why would you want to do that? Which he still reminds me when I run into him at the supermarket in Gunnedah over the fresh fruit aisle that he was the one who told me I should do this. So anyway, it's funny where you end up in life. But so excited to be here with you all today as part of this summit, and also to be here in my capacity as Minister for Education and Early Childhood Learning. As Murat said, I'm a parent as well. My eldest daughter's in kindergarten. We've got an 18-month-old Matilda. So sort of living this life of juggling and also seeing that importance in education and investing in education for our next generation is something that I feel very strongly about, and I'm sure that that's shared with many of you in this room. I'm excited that today's summit has that particular focus on education, because I really do think that that is the key for success in life for everybody, no matter where you live and no matter where you come from. So I thought today I'd just speak to you about a few things that we're doing in education more broadly, looking forward to the opportunity to hear more about what you've got planned today. So as Chris said, we are seeing massive investments in infrastructure here, particularly in Western Sydney, but right across New South Wales. So over the next 4 years alone, we will be spending over $2 billion on school projects throughout the Western Sydney region. So right now we're working on and ramping up work on close to 80 different schools as part of this $6.7 billion investment into 190 new and upgraded schools. So of the 190 that we're working on statewide, 8 of them are here in Western Sydney, because we know it's important to invest in the infrastructure. We know we have growing communities out here, and most importantly, we know that the students attending the schools in Western Sydney deserve to be learning, and the teachers deserve to be teaching in those world-class facilities. So this area is a key priority for us in terms of our school infrastructure, and I'm sure you'll hear a little bit more about that when School Infrastructure speak to you later today. I think it's also important to make the point that we're not just investing in the bricks and mortar. I think infrastructure is clearly important, but also the work that we're doing around needs-based funding and what that means in real terms to many schools right across this region. We continue to invest those records amounts of the Gonski funding, needs-based, sector-blind, and last year what that meant in real terms in New South Wales was an additional $6.4 billion in needs-based funding through to 2027. And to give you a context of what that could mean, because obviously we're talking very, very large amounts of money, I chose one school from this area just to pick out as an example. So Westfield Sports High, they're receiving more than $610,000 in additional what we call RAM funding, which is our resource allocation model funding. And what that is money that goes to schools to determine how they need to spend it, what their priorities are. So a lot of schools use it for different things, but really similar areas that people tend to use that money for are for things like engaging specialist teachers, employing additional staff with expertise in things like speech pathology, or engaging literacy and numeracy experts to tailor that support for individual students. So we are putting more and more money into our schools, into our local schools, particularly in Western Sydney, so that they can make those decisions as how to spend that money to best enable their students to grow and to thrive, which is very important. I also think when we come to talking about school infrastructure, another key element for me as we embark on this, biggest infrastructure projects in education that we've seen since Federation, there's a few ways I think that we can be more innovative with what we're doing. One of the things that is really important to us as a government is doing everything we can to make these school facilities and buildings accessible to all members of the community at every stage of their life. And what that means is I think we need to think differently about how schools are being built and the way that their facilities are shared. Too often we see them fenced off and almost separated from society, and one of the areas that I'm really keen to see more of as Minister is opening up our schools to the broader community. It was something that my predecessor, Rob Stokes, was very strong on, and I think there's more opportunities to do more of that into the future. We have to make sure that we do the best with the resources that we have, and these are community resources. They are there for all of us to use and to share, and I think that that's really important, that our school designs particularly make sure that we bring that into account, ways that we can have community as part of the school, and make sure that we have the libraries, the sports halls, the fields to be used where that shared use is appropriate, so that that level of engagement between the school and the greater community can exist. The other challenge that we have in infrastructure, which is, in a sense, not unique to Australia or even to New South Wales, but how we need to think about our school design and how that can revolve around our changing population and the rapid growth that we do see, and particularly standing here with you all today in this part of Sydney, it would not be foreign to you when we need to talk about population density issues that we have around our urban centres that are growing exponentially, and Western Sydney is a classic example of that. And one of the problems with that is that we don't really have the room anymore to build the expansive schools with the acres of green space and the large playgrounds that would have been more prevalent years ago. But we also know it's important for children to learn in an environment that encourages physical activity, both for their overall health and their mental well-being. So what we've had to do is start to reconceptualise how we design schools in densely populated areas. We've got to focus on vertical space in instances sometimes rather than land size. And a good example of this is obviously our Arthur Phillip, which we're building in Western Sydney, making it a vertical school, which I'm sure is not without its challenges for school infrastructure. But again, it's about thinking outside the box so that we can give students the facilities that they deserve in a new and modern way. I think it's really important going forward, and I hope this is something that you get out of today, is that there's real opportunities, I think, now to make Western Sydney an educational powerhouse, not just in relation to school but also early childhood and also for the university and tertiary sector. And I understand that you're hearing from some members of those areas later on today, because education is important. As I said at the beginning, education is what provides opportunity for everybody, no matter where you live or where you come from. But these days, I think it's much more about just getting a job and boosting your income potential. It's about making sure that we educate the next generation and to be the best they can be and to build a more just and engaged society. And there's a lot of schools here in Western Sydney that are really embodying that purpose, particularly around providing opportunities for students from underprivileged backgrounds and from Aboriginal families as well. As some of you would know, I was formerly the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs. I had 2 years in that portfolio and I really, really enjoyed that opportunity. And one thing that was very, very clear to me while I had that position was that no matter where I went, whether I spent time in Western Sydney or Western New South Wales and everywhere in between, was that the one thing underpinning everything that people would come to talk to me about was about education. How do we get a better opportunity for our children, for our grandchildren, for our great-grandchildren? And I think the way that we can tie this together going forward is exciting, but also rewarding. And I know that there are a lot of schools and early childhood services in Western Sydney providing that extra support for Aboriginal families. Wayland Public Schools Preschool, I know, participates in some programs to engage Aboriginal parents and students in the early years. Working particularly in the early years is so critical. I'm still the Minister for Early Childhood. I was the Minister for that for a couple of years previously as well. And I think we can't underestimate how important those first few years of learning are to help set children on their journey. And particularly when we can engage well with Aboriginal families in that space, it's incredibly exciting and rewarding. I also want to acknowledge the work that the Clontarf Foundation do in many schools in Western Sydney. I visited a few of their campuses out here, particularly some of the campuses at Chifley College. I believe that they're across all 5 campuses for Chifley College and a number of other high schools as well. And the work that they do to engage with those young men in that instance and get them involved in the school community and their sport, self-respect going forward is something that I think is really important, and again, another key element where we can provide support. I also want to mention, I don't want to embarrass her, but I know Lil Gordon's here, who I've done some work with on the Kimberwali Centre, and it is incredible. I know I'm not the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs anymore, but it still has a very deep place in my heart, because to be involved in that process with Lil, particularly with the young people who are in their engagement group, and I don't want to steal your thunder, Lil, I know you're speaking later, so I won't talk about it too much, but going and visiting the site at the Old Wayland High School, talking to those young people about what they want that centre to be and what they want to achieve, they were some of the brightest, talented people I've ever met in my entire life, and knowing that they're driving this project just gives me goosebumps. It's going to be a wonderful, wonderful thing for this part of the world, and indeed I think for our nation. I just think it's going to be an incredible centre, and I'm so excited for that to come online soon. And as I said, not technically my area anymore, but always part of my heart, because I think it's a really, really important project. Just lastly, I want to mention, while it's important what we're doing in terms of our school infrastructure, it's also incredibly important what we're teaching in the classroom, what perspective and what life skills we're giving our children. And one of the areas that we're looking at the moment, there's a thing called the Melbourne Declaration. There's been various iterations of it. Effectively, it's one that the federal government is now reviewing. It's about setting out the purpose of education. So it talks about how schooling should promote equity and excellence, that all young Australians should become successful learners, confident and creative individuals, and active and informed citizens. So every so often the Melbourne Declaration gets a new iteration. There's another review of it underway. We'll have a couple of community and consultation sessions here in New South Wales, just 2. One will be out in Tamworth in the northwest, and the other one will be here in Western Sydney, because it's very important for me as Minister that we get feedback from your community about ways forward in education. But part of that, or I guess a way that links to that, which could be a little more controversial, is on Friday we had a meeting of all the education ministers in Melbourne, as we do from time to time. And one of the things that I raised was talking about a review into NAPLAN. Now, a lot of you would be aware of NAPLAN. It's an important test that we use in terms of measuring students' successes and how they're going in terms of their schooling. But for me, one of the issues was, well, how are we measuring this and what is success? Now, we have NAPLAN, that's what we use, but in my view, it's quite a blunt instrument. It's been not without its detractors and its challenges for quite some time, and I think being over 10 years old, now would be the time that we need to have a look at that test, what it does, how it measures success, and if there's ways that we can do it better. I think that it's time that we did start with a bit of a blank canvas and came up with a diagnostic test that was genuinely useful to parents and teachers and government. To be clear, for us as a government in New South Wales, we absolutely support diagnostic testing. It's very important that we do have it. It helps parents make informed decisions about their child's future. It gives schools the data that they need to identify subject areas where students might be struggling or where potentially individual students might need assistance, and that's essential. And we've always been a strong supporter in New South Wales of that diagnostic testing. But I don't think that should mean that we refuse to reform NAPLAN or look at ways that we can improve it and make it more fit for purpose, particularly for our students going into these modern times where changes are unprecedented. I think that reforming our diagnostic testing is nothing new. Back many years ago now, it feels like, when I was at school, we had the basic skills test. In 2008, we then moved to NAPLAN. So it's over 10 years old, and we think it's time that it had a refresh, because one of the concerns about NAPLAN is that while it's intended for that diagnostic tool, it's intended to measure student growth, it's also supposed to help measure the performance of teachers, the performance of schools, the performance of sectors, and the performance of the state's education system as a whole. And in my view, I think with a test like that trying to be a jack of all trades, it ends up being a bit of a master of none. It provides data that can be misleading and misused. You know, there are certainly reports that it can distort teaching practice, and I think it's lost the confidence of a lot of parents and a lot of education stakeholders as well. So we've got some ideas about how we want to do that in New South Wales. We think it's time that we had a look at it. This was something that I did raise with my colleagues on Friday, and not everyone shared that view, and that's fine. It's all about healthy dialogue. But New South Wales and Queensland and Victoria, as three of the biggest states, are going to do some work together about ways that we think that we can improve NAPLAN. And it is topical, and it is a little bit contentious to come out and do that work. But frankly, as ministers, we expect our schools to help us to give students that continuous improvement. We want teachers and principals to continuously improve. So I think as ministers we should find ways to continuously improve our testing systems as well, because ultimately that will make a difference with the data that we get. It will help us better shape the support that we provide to students, not just here in Western Sydney but right across the state, and if other states get on board, across the nation as well. So I think it's important that as ministers sometimes you need to stand up and say, now's the time to have a look at something which can be improved. That's what we were able to do, or I guess I was able to do on behalf of the government last Friday. And that's something that we'll continue to do, because I do think it's important that we look for improvements where we can make it, and as I said, not just to expect that from our students but also to do it ourselves as ministers. So just finally, I'd like to say thank you so much for having me today. I'm sorry that I can't be with you for the whole day, but it looks like you've got a wonderful agenda of speakers and sessions for the rest of the morning and the afternoon, which looks great. And I think to be here in Western Sydney for this summit is incredibly important. A new city is appearing here before our eyes in Western Sydney, and education for me is central to ensuring that this city remains one of opportunity and one of prosperity. So thank you for having me, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Minister. It's her first gig with the dialogue, and I don't hope it won't be her last. Can I also, recognising also your former role as Minister of Aboriginal Affairs, was remiss of me before not to pay my respects as well to elders past, present and emerging. From my mob who came as involuntary tourists to Western Sydney 222 years ago, to those who cared for country for 50,000 years plus, thank you, and thank you for welcoming to your country. My pleasure to vote thanks to the Minister. Maybe ask her a couple of questions, and then we're asking her to stay with a few minutes while we honour some of the both student scholarships that we're announcing today for public school students in Western Sydney and to some of our award winners. But firstly, Minister, can I make you the first recipient of the Best of the West?
Thank you very much.
Freshly off the printers this week.
Wonderful.
You will find not only some of the great places to eat, some of the great Reesby Beach and every other little hidden gem of Western Sydney. You'll find a particular section on innovation and education, talking about not only the wonderful edifice that we're building here at WSU, here in Bankstown, City Unis campus, in Parramatta, ACU in Blacktown, etc., but also some of the great public schools of the region. And I know you're a Gunnedah Public and Gunnedah High School girl, and I'm a Burnside Public and Cumberland High at Burnside Public, next to the Burnside Homes at North Parramatta, where we had an awful lot of stolen generation kids who were educated too and went to school. They always had the worst lunch. Paul Bugger's got the hard bread rolls, and this whole battle between the kids at Burnside Homes, but lifelong friendships formed. But I suppose to ask you a question about some of that, you've already gone to the NAPLAN water, which is a thing, and your predecessor delved into the STEM pool at some stage, controversially, 3 days before he spoke it out there last year. And I know the Treasurer has been talking particularly about outcomes in education, and while I think in Western Sydney we're desperate to be measured like everybody else on excellence and performance, I suppose it comes down to what the metrics are for the outcomes. We call it the latte line, or I'm increasingly call it the colour-bond fence, the diagonal line across Sydney, from Richmond Airport to Mascot Airport, that diagonal line. And without a doubt, NAPLAN results are not a proud feature outside the southwest side of that line. So in determining some metrics for outcomes which to guide funding, it will be obviously not straight NAPLAN, but some consideration that we are still facing some disadvantage compared to the north of the line, and a blended model that can make sure that when outcomes is the metric, the outcomes reflect a whole range of issues to Western Sydney.
Sure. Thanks, Krish. I think it's really interesting, the conversations around outcomes-based funding which came out of the budget, and you mentioned that the Treasurer made some comments around that, which he did. So one of the things that we're doing, and education is the first portfolio or agency that we're doing it in, but it will come across all of the areas. So it'll go to transport and health and everywhere. We were just sort of the guinea pigs, if you like. One of the things that all of the agencies and departments will be doing is putting together business plans, and part of the recommendation is around making sure that all the money, every dollar that we put into it, can somehow be attributed to improving student outcomes. So there was some media at the time which talked about, schools will have to justify their funding, they'll have to get results or their funding will be cut. That is not what it is at all. What it is about when I go to Treasury and say we want X amount of money for this school or this program, how can I then justify that it will be rerouted or that it will all be spent to make sure that we see improvements in student outcomes, that we're best helping our principals and our teachers to teach our students to get the great results that we know they're capable of. So it's definitely going to be a very consultative piece of work. It's not about being sort of top down or as I said, schools that need support most being penalised in any way. We absolutely still support needs-based Gonski funding. That's 100%. It's locked in. We've signed up. It's legislated. We're not moving away from that at all. But this is about making sure that we're smart with where we put our taxpayer dollars, make sure that what we're doing is the programs that we know make a difference for kids and their outcomes. And there'll be a range of ways that we'll measure it. One of the things that we announced earlier this year was an expansion of a program that we'd been running for a few years called Bump It Up. And Bump It Up was about trying to see more students move into the top bands of literacy and numeracy using NAPLAN, because while we think it's got its problems, it's the only test that we have at the moment to use. But one of the things that we found in the 137 schools that we rolled Bump It Up in was that we saw really great improvements when targets were set towards working towards those outcomes. So we're going to expand that right across all 2,200 public schools, but we're also expanding what we look at. So part of it will be literacy and numeracy, yes, using NAPLAN, but we can also look at other ways that we do those measurements. But we're expanding it to include things like attendance, to include wellbeing, because it's important that we know if students are enjoying their school experience and what they're getting out of their education, and we want to make sure that that's part of the metric that we look at as well. And the other one will be sort of an equity slice, so looking more at kids who come from more disadvantaged backgrounds. How are they tracking? Do they need more support? Does the school need more support to assist them? So it's kind of looking at the school community more broadly rather than just focusing on that literacy and numeracy, which is important, but we know that part of the school experience is how well-rounded a student is when they leave, and that's something we want to look at improving and measuring as well.
Fantastic. Part of my unique education relevance now is the father of a 24-year-old and 19-year-old, both working in before and after school care in the public school system, and the father of a 3-year-old, shopping to which 3-year-old, to which school she should go to later on. And the big choice is there, and I suppose going to touch some of those touch points for any new education minister. It is STEM or not STEM, it's selective or not selective, it's comprehensive or single-sex schools, the big pieces. Recognising that the past 2 or 3 years we've been working very closely with your school infrastructure team on building the hardware, and we're probably now also focusing much more on the curriculum as well, the software of education that we need to as these guys are underway, building Arthur Phillip skyscrapers and flat schools and communities and all sorts of things so magnificently. Within that, my high school, Cumberland High, was luckily I sat for the James Roos exam, got in the early 70s, but there were no girls there, so I wasn't going there. But my brother managed to get expelled into James Roos, which is quite an achievement. Our father was the federal member for Parramatta at the time. Might have had a little bit to do with it, I'm just guessing, back in the day. The only child ever expelled into the best high school in the Southern Hemisphere. But it was 300 metres from my school and still 300 places on the My School website from my school. How do we go forward in a Western Sydney sense with Baulkham Hills and James Roos down to the old Hawkesbury Ag, which is now going, or Hurlstad Ag going up to Hawkesbury, STEM schools at Science Park and everywhere. While getting that absolute excellence we need, how do we not leave behind those stuck or involved in comprehensive high schools? How do we get that balance so that we can get both excellence and inclusivity at the same time?
It's a good question, and look, it's the challenge, I guess, as being Education Minister. One of the things that we did announce recently with the Premier is that we want to build a new selective high school in Western Sydney. It's very much in its early stages. We don't have a location, we don't have any of that sorted out yet. What we wanted to do was say we want to come out and talk to the community about that, and we wanted our intention to be clear that it was going to be a new selective high school, so there'll be more conversations about that coming online. I've already had some really good feedback in some initial conversations, just as people who I've met at different events have raised it with me around, what can we do to try and make more places available for local kids particularly? Are there ways that we can rethink the model of selective high schools that really benefit Western Sydney? And frankly, I'm really open to those sort of discussions. That's what we'll be consulting with the community on now. But what we did as part of that program as well was also introduced a really big overhaul of what is sort of colloquially known as the Gifted and Talented program. And we're calling it High Potential and Gifted because we know that there are kids with great potential in every single school, and we want to make sure that no matter where they go, whether they're academically gifted or sporting or artistic or whatever their strengths might be, we want to be able to support them and have the teachers and principals have the capacity to make them be able to be their best as well. So we're trying to do a lot together so that we do end up with a situation, as you said, Chris, where no matter where you go, whether you're at a selective school or whatever choice a parent wants to make for their child, whether they want to go into the Catholic sector or the independent sector or one of our public schools, that they can make those decisions knowing that their child has every opportunity, and if they end up at the local high school like I did, like you were, I had great things by going to Gunnedah High School. I had a wonderful education and it really did set me on a great path to be able to make a contribution. So I think we need to tell the stories about how great our public schools are and make sure we've got the support for our teachers and support by having these programs such as those, particularly for children with high potential, rolled out across all our schools so that everyone can be their best no matter which school they attend.
Fantastic. So noticing that former principals of two great schools of Granville Boys and Punchbowl Boys in the front row, the great schools aren't necessarily selective schools across Western Sydney continue to go really strongly. Noticing we've been approached by two GPS schools wanting a Western Sydney outlet. Cameron, I think they want our rugby players particularly. There's a little bit of fishing. Paul Cameron Klein, one of our patrons, a former St Dominic's Penrith boy, having a celebrated fight with Izzy Folau, Westfield Sports side boy, in rugby terms. But everybody's waking up to the potential of Western Sydney, and that will continue. But can I then, in just thanking the Minister, it's this level of engagement. I think you've heard today from a person who realises that we often talk to transport ministers about trying to remind them it's not just an economic portfolio, it's a social portfolio because of the tyranny of distance, the fact that people across Western Sydney have bigger commute times, harder struggles, worse access to public transport than those in the north and the east, and that has to overcome it. And I don't think we need to remind also the Minister today that education is not only a social policy lever, it's also an economic policy lever. The greatest potential Western Sydney has to fully, rightfully take its place, completely and utterly in every element of equality across this great city is through education, and I think that's why we're so committed to it, why the people here today are, and I think we found in the girl from Gunnedah High, also understanding the challenges for regional education. I like that for Western Sydney education, so you can be assured of our really strong support as you go forward. Thank you. If you please join me in thanking Mr Mitchell.